Welcome to Rauta's history series of Finnish Black Metal from the 90s. That is, bands that started in the 90s and ever since progressed wherever they may go. And with the 8 previous episodes, I pretty much went through the biggest ones, the original ones, the ones that really started the whole black metal thing in Finland, and of course a lot of other important bands. Now there was a little bit of a break after 8 episodes in the series, but decided to continue it as I promised to do. If there is a one topic or theme that fits today's 3 bands, it's that they all changed style, some more drastically than the others, but nonetheless they all changed styles. And as that is the theme, I will try to introduce you to the bands and of course tell you what happened throughout the years with my very, very limited knowledge. Obviously, I do have some information beyond the typical Metal Archive site stuff, but yeah, I'm not gonna claim that I'm expert or anything about the topic. I'm merely trying to talk you about the bands, their music, and their changes, and of course give you a little bit of history lesson in the series. If you've been following the previous episodes, you pretty much know the drill. And as with previous years, this time I decided to go whatever started first. That is, whoever of these 3 bands put out the first demo and all, and then we will go in that order through each and every discography. So let's go. Today's bands are Throes of Dawn, Mustan, Kuun, Lapset, and Thyrane. And now we'll start with Throes of Dawn. Some might say that 2 of these 3 bands are more black metal adjacent bands than actual black metal bands, but I think that would be kind of a splitting hairs, especially when all these bands started with black metal music. Now, some changed towards something else sooner than later, but nonetheless they all changed and in various parts of their career. And actually there is one band that made a comeback to the given style. But first, Throes of Dawn. They started quite early, given Finnish standards, in 1994. They came from the western coast of Finland, which also hosted quite a bit of other bands, including bands like Oceans and True Black Dawn. But Throes of Dawn were there from 1994. That really seems very early on, especially when, given the history of Finnish black metal, there were not that much stuff going on prior, say, 1995. Obviously, the first wave, bands like Impel, Nazarene, Beherit, Archko were there few years earlier. And while back in the days, that difference from, say, 1989 or 1990 to 1994 felt like a lot of years. These days, some 30 plus years later, it doesn't really seem to matter. But obviously, Finnish bands were there a little bit later than a lot of Norwegian or Swedish counterparts, not to mention the Greek. Anyway, talking about Throes of Dawn, they started as early as 1994, but their first album came as late as 1997. I'm using those quotation marks because back in the days, or obviously a lot of Norwegian bands had done multiple albums by 1997, and by that time a lot of Norwegian black metal were kind of in decline phase. So a lot of Norwegian bands started from the early 90s, and by 1997 a lot of things have changed, even changed styles. Some of the Finnish bands were merely starting. It was almost, now in hindsight especially, like passing the torch. We're done with the black metal, you Finns, you go on, take the torch, move on. So, Throes of Dawn started with a couple of demos, as the case was back in the 90s, and then they moved on to do album called Pakkasherra. Feels a little bit, that bit funny title, because Pakkasherra roughly means Lord of Frost. So it's kind of a cheesy, feels like, we're talking about some Christmas elves or something, but in a way it's almost very nostalgic, kind of a romantic name. And this comes with a quality cover. You have a wolf with some, snow and all. So there is some kind of a Finnish nocturnal momentary related to, winter times and wolves. Can't have black metal without wolves. There are plenty of bands with that theme. Now, this first album is kind of a very, very demo-ish. It's kind of obvious that even though the actual demo phase is now over, these guys are still figuring out what to do, how to make it sound, and all that stuff. And now, mind you, there wasn't much of a budget back in the days for black metal albums. Even though by 1997, sorry, things were kind of already picking up the pace and all, it still wasn't as big as obviously nowadays. And even nowadays, we're not really talking about mainstream metal. But at least nowadays, it's a whole different ball game. But Pakkasherra is very much a product of its time. Kind of a basic black metal, more on the atmospheric side of things. Not exactly very violent or raw, but nothing really like whatever later on resurfaced or became this thing called atmospheric black metal. However, that was pretty much the name of the game. And if you look at the genre definitions here on Metal Archive site, it says progressive folk melodic black metal. Kind of a mismatch or mixed bag of goodies, and later on something else. But these were the early things what was going on. Soon they would, continue with Dreams of Black Earth. That sounded all really from the, title like something was more serious. And to be honest, this is in a way a kind of a logical successor to the first album, but in terms of quality, nothing really evolved that much. Now, things started changing around 2000 and 2004, roughly here between the third and fourth album. This is the era with Binding of the Spirit, where they kind of started going away from black metal even further. So what started kind of a basic standard default Nordic black metal setting was changing to something different. And these steps were maybe kind of a small ones, baby steps if you will, but it was clearly kind of the momentum shift which was already happening. And by the Quicksilver Clouds album, it was evident that this band wasn't exactly black metal all about anymore. They started doing that, what is here described as progressive gothic metal. To be honest, no, I'm not sure how progressive they really are. Sure, you have some interesting drum patterns and that kind of stuff, but mostly it's just gothic metal. Some nice, ideas here and there, but I would use the word progressive in a very much like this, quotation marks once again, because it's very debatable how progressive you are. I mean, if you compare to, say, something like totally different, Pink Floyd, their earlier surely progressive, they later are more like AOR, and if you really think about it, this is more like AOR kind of a gothic metal rather than really progressive. So once again, it depends to which you're comparing to. If you compare it to metal music, you'd say he has some progressive elements, but other than that, not so much. With the Great Fleet of Echoes, they moved even further what started with Quicksilver. So by this point, the black metal was not much anymore a game. Vocals had changed, riffs have changed, the total overall feeling. If I would say that some album is more that progressive thing, it would be this Our Voices Shall Remain, which I think is the best album by Throes of Dawn ever. Throughout the whole career, pretty much, in my opinion, they were looking for something that they wanted to do, something that they could do in an interesting ways. But I would say none of these albums, the early ones, none of them really did that trick. Maybe it's my matter of taste, or maybe it was just a little bit of too much of that mixed bag of goodies kind of a thing, because Our Voices Shall Remain feels like that first step that they really figured out. This is what we can do, something that we want to do, something we are able to just, finish the way it was supposed to be. So the early black metal eras here didn't last for that long, and in hindsight you could make that critical statement that maybe they were a little bit of tourism, in terms of black metal. But then again, a lot of young guys started with some sort of extreme metal and then moved on to something different. Whether you call it that tourism or just, a phase that band members want to go through, yeah, it's a matter of taste rather than something else. What is more important also, when we are talking about the whole history here, not just the black metal years, is that only two guys from the early era of the band are the same from 1994. Everybody else changed. So you had this vocals and guitar guy, also bass a little bit later, but guitars and vocals remain the same and everything else is totally different. So it's almost like there are two different bands with the name of Throes of Dawn, stylistically and also member-wise. If you look at the past members, there were quite a few people early 1990s to early 2000s who were different, and then some other people along the road which got changed. Nothing unusual there. But to really summarize their point or meaning to Finnish black metal, pretty much can be said they did Pakkasherra and then they moved on. So if you missed that back in the days, well, you probably didn't miss much of Finnish black metal history. But it's nonetheless one of those early birds in terms of history with Finnish black metal, so cannot be ignored. Then we move to Mustan Kuun Lapset, another band from the mid-90s in terms of Finnish black metal. Now, they changed the name early on, but with 1995 and onwards, they did black metal and then something different. Once again, they're here labeled as melodic black metal early, melodic black gothic metal later. These are really, really debatable, but I can, to a certain degree, really agree with that. I would, however, say that they actually did some black death metal things along the way, not purely black metal. Melodic black metal, sure, especially in the beginning, but then there are lots of death metal things along the road, and especially towards the end, you could just safely remove the word black and say gothic metal. So, quite similar, but also very different from Throes of Dawn. Now, Mustan Kuun Lapset is now officially gone. They finished their career in 2023, starting from the 1993 point, where they celebrated the 30th anniversary, and that's when I did the interview with these guys as well. And that was a nice finishing point for them, and now they have moved on to something different, and which you can find under members list. So much like Throes of Dawn, they started with a couple of demos, but for them it took more than just a couple of years to do the debut album. It was actually that late as 2002 when Surun Tuoja, Bringer of Sorrow, came to be. So 7 years, give or take, if we start counting from 1995. That was, once again, very quickly followed by Tauninhaita 2003, Grave of a Beauty, something like that, roughly translated. And these were kind of bringing that melodic black metal to the whole game. Especially Surun Tuoja was like a pretty standard 1990s sounding black metal album from the more melodic stuff, but it was indeed 2002 album. So it's kind of interesting that it took them quite a few years, basically after that kind of a 1990s sounding trend was pretty much gone, or so they were a little bit latecomers in that sense. However, you have to remember a lot of Finnish black metal bands didn't enter the album era before year 2000. So a lot of bands who started in 1995, 1996 or so didn't really do albums before 2001 or whatever. So in that sense, Mustan Kuun Lapset is no exception, but more, one of those who kind of maintained the whole idea. Now, Talvenranta, Shore of Winter, came 2005. So once again, very quickly after the two initial albums. Here it already started changing. Their poetic style, as it may be with the album names and all, were however turning more into some kind of a melodic black death hybrid. So it's kind of weird because, their beauty, their poetic style isn't really death metallic, but they have that level of aggression. Actually, they have way more aggression that they're probably given credit to with their music. So they were not really that cheesy, melodic, atmospheric black metal, but quite violent at some times, which made even more contrast when we move on towards the later albums. Before that, however, they did album like Viimeinen laulu kuolemasta, the last song about death, or Saatto. I don't even know how to translate it, but it basically means when people are going to die soon, say they are cancer patients, they call something like Saatto vaihe, which is the phase before, you're really going to enter death. So there is probably proper word to translate it. Someone is, I'm sure, going to comment in the comment section, but for the sake of the video, I didn't even remember this album name, so obviously I'm not using time to Google translate it, but you get the idea. Then 2019, they did an album called Valo, Light, which is like acoustic versions of their earlier albums. So by this time, now more than 20 years in the business, they totally changed the style, and this change started very gradually over the years. So what started like melodic black metal, then became melodic death black metal, started suddenly, but not too suddenly, more gradually changing towards something gothic. And I think this Valo was really kind of a momentum shift where it nailed like, okay, we do this acoustic album, and then there's no way going back. And with the last album, Crown from 2021, the style was really like, okay, this transition is now complete. This is totally different. And that remained to be their latest album. Now, there were like these singles and compilations and whatever along the way, but I guess we can safely say Suruaika, which is the Time of Mourning EP, finished their career, what started 30 years before. Overall, pretty interesting career development in a way, if you consider that they had this break from 2007 to 2010, give or take. I won't take this as written in stone, whatever is on the Metal Archives site, because, excuse me, sometimes there are errors. But these give you roughly a good idea what was going on. And by the way, like it's mentioned here, Mustan kuun lapset literally translates to Children of the Black Moon. So very poetic names from the very get-go, even if their music was not as always so soft or poetic to begin with. And as many black metal bands, their lyrics went from Satanism and anti-Christianity towards more poetic things like poetry, nature, death, and longing. So yeah, kind of similar in terms of, progression and change as with Throes of Dawn, but the path was slightly different. So from black metal to gothic, but just with a little bit of a different path. And now we go to the last band of the game, which is most black metal of them all, Thyrane. Excuse me. So 1995, pretty much the same era as Mustan kuun lapset, but they were later to the game with their Black Harmony demo 1997. However, this demo was not just a demo like so many other bands in the game. Their Black Harmony demo sounded like finished album, very good. One of the best black metal demos of all time. Not just from Finland, but all time. It's almost like, let's do a Finnish version of Emperor with a little bit Gehenna and Immortal in the mix, and you have right there. It's symphonic, very good sounding, very professional, very good. It was later on released, as proper CD and whatever, so clearly a lot more than your typical demo tape, even if it's obviously officially listed as a demo. But technically speaking, we could talk about that as if it was their debut album. That really set the bar really high. It was one of the most pro stuff ever from Finland, and it's, especially in hindsight, feels like how on earth these guys in 1997 managed to do something so good sounding, so pro sounding, when a lot of demos were really just some kind of rehearsal tapes or just poorly executed versions of what would happen later on. However, Thyrane, much like these other bands, and so many other bands from Finland, to be honest, changed their style. Not so much with Symphonies of Infernality, which came only 2 years later. With this, they kind of maintained the same thing, just added, more ammunition to the whole game. Pretty much like Emperor in a way, stylistically, and as well as in terms of production, but also, in my opinion, the slight drop in quality was right there. For me, Black Harmony is the best Thyrane thing. Symphony is maybe the second one. Anyway, after this one, they started changing. So what was here more evident, you have the classic Lucifer kind of a thing going on with this one. As well as, by the way, this is worth showing since this is more a proper demo with an album, like 35 minutes. Here you have the studs and spikes and inverted cross. Now, these two were very much keeping, the traditional 1990s black metal flame going on. But with Spirit of Rebellion, now you might notice something. First of all, traditional symbols are more on the side. While there is this pentagram, sure, it is almost like a new era started. If this reminds you of what Satyricon were doing with Rebel Extravaganza and all, spot on. Musically, this was going to the direction which is mentioned here as well, blackened industrial metal. So early on and later on, symphonic black metal, then blackened industrial metal. the mid parts. Now, Spirit of Rebellion was this transition phase of an album. What happened after two kind of a pure blood black metal albums, this was like a step towards some kind of a modernized black metal with, lots of industrial thing in the mix. So once again, if this makes you think that, Rebel Extravaganza from Satyricon was a product of its time in sound, bit very cold and sterile, and, putting white instead of black, and, cutting hair and all, Spirit of Rebellion is basically an, brother from another mother kind of a thing to that. That was once again going to change with the third album, Hypnotic 2003. This doesn't even look like a black metal album, and nor it is, musically speaking. This is, as you can see from the logos being removed and all that stuff, visual style, even maybe in terms of, songwriting, titles and whatever, this actually was a industrial metal album. And while not bad, it was like they lost the game, they dropped the ball and became something totally different. In my opinion, it's their weakest album ever so far. It was like, what were these guys thinking of? Why they decided to go to that direction? And maybe that's why it is also in general, the latest, the last ranked album in their discography. However, 2 years later after that, Travesty of Heavenly Essence, suddenly maybe, while not the most obvious black metal cover on there, I mean, it's like a hobo on a cover in a way, but also getting back to this old logo, suddenly this was more like, let's get black metal in the game. It was more like this kind of, in a way, spiritual successor to whatever started with Symphonies of Infernality, or maybe even to a Spirit of Rebellion. But I would say closer to Symphonies in that sense. If this would have come after Symphonies, but before Spirit of Rebellion, would have made total sense. So they, in a way, they kind of are carved their path to a different direction once again. So they made back to black metal style, unlike these two other bands which I mentioned. But it's curious, this was 20 years ago. And even though the band called it a day in around 2006, whatever, they came back 10 years ago. They have made some shows and all, but nothing has happened in terms of albums whatsoever past 10 years, even though they have been active. So once again, it's pretty interesting to think what might have happened if Thyrane managed to keep it, active all the way through instead of just calling it a day and, making a comeback. Before we go on and call it a day with this video, one thing is worth mentioning. These are all from various parts of Finland. Throes of Dawn, like I mentioned, from the western coast of Finland, so like opposite coast from Sweden. Very Swedish spoken part of Finland, not exactly south nor north, but in the middle. Whereas Mustan Lahti is from Hollola, which is closer to Lahti, land like Clandestine Blaze and all that stuff. So more on the middle area of Finland and more closer to south than other two bands. Whereas Thyrane is from Kemi, which is the home of Tico Tico Studio, where actually Impel Nazarene did their albums back in the days. So very, very far up north. So geographically, these bands had nothing to do with one another, and however that is the case, I mean, they all sound different, but also they all change style over the years. So this kind of the point, which I guess was lost along the way here, is that despite of these, different geographical locations and despite of different histories with the band members and all, they all kind of went, in a way, the same kind of thing. Bands start as black metal bands and then they start shifting to something else as they grow older and a lot of that. And now you probably think that's exactly what happened in Norway too, when bands like, Emperor went to that direction or Mayhem went to that direction and so on. So a lot of bands tend to change over the years, especially when the initial black metal flame has been extinguished and all. And then again, there are also bands like, say, Clandestine Blaze or Impel Nazarene, who never left the scene, never changed the style too much, so go figure. Now, this is another set of 3 bands which I wanted to talk to you about, not exactly big ones, not exactly the demo level bands, but bands that, at some point kind of ceased to exist, as at least in terms of being a black metal band, but came to be something else later on. Worth checking out if you want to know a little bit more about Finnish black metal history. So coming in episode 10, we're gonna go even further in the underground, even less known bands, but bands that didn't change style so much. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. And if you need information about the bands or certain questions, shoot me up. At least, so for Mustan, kuun, lapset, and Thyrane, I can probably share a story or two, having met the guys over the years and all, even played with Mustan, kuun, lapset back in the days. But that's about it. You will find these Metal Archive site links in the description box if you want to go further with the band links and all. And for music, probably available in your favorite streaming service. So clickety-click, start listening. And now, off you go. Bye-bye.